Hey, listen, just remember me fondly. And go ahead and sleep. I'll just sleep out here on the couch. You just get some rest. It sounds like you're tired. Do you see how that's a diffuser? And do you see how that's exactly what is needed for this woman to understand that she's being a self-lover? I mean, as soon as he reacts in grace, it's like that text in Romans where it talks about heaping coals on someone's head. When we come with grace and love, the people who are not exhibiting grace and love really get the idea or the picture that, hey, I'm being a jerk here. Oh, this is improper. This isn't how I should be acting. And it motivates them towards change. Yeah, sometimes we react harshly. Sometimes we run and we hide. We stuff things down. These are improper reactions. We need to respond. When our spouses come against us without love and without grace, we need to be the ones who give it. I always talk to couples and I say, someone's got to put on the big boy pants and the big girl pants around here. Because in situations where both people are living in hate, someone has to change that chemistry. Someone has to change that equation. Someone has to start with the love somewhere. And where love begins, it can grow. But when love is never brought to a conflict, the conflict will just get worse. People, you can't keep fighting the same fight that you've had for the 20 years that you've been married. You cannot keep doing that. 20 years should have told you that it's not going to get resolved that way. You got to give peace a chance. Thank you, John and Oko. He loves his spouse by responding with grace. And then he leaves the change in his spouse's life to God. Look what write that down. We need to let God change our spouse since we can't. Have I gotten that clear enough to everybody this morning? Can you change your spouse? Someone say no. I'll ask you again. Can you change your spouse? No, you can't. But some of us say that in this room at this time, and in our hearts, we really believe that we can somehow. That's why as wives we keep nagging that dude. Because maybe after the 4 millionth time of me saying this to him, it'll finally set in. Or as husbands we say, you know what, I'm just going to freeze her out. Or I'm going to try to control her more. And when she finally realizes that I'm serious about this, she'll relent. But we're just making things worse. We can't change our spouses. Only God can. Look what happens next in the story. She opens the door, says, I opened for my lover, verse 8, but my lover had left. He was gone. Look what happens to her heart. As he reacts with grace, she realizes her error. She says her heart sank in his departure. I looked for him, but I didn't find him. She leaves the palace. I mean, she's running through the whole house. She's trying to find Solomon so that she can make things right. I called him, but he did not answer. She goes outside and starts running through the city streets. It says there that the watchmen found me as they made the rounds of the city. Here's what would happen in those days. There wasn't a lot of light. It wasn't like they had street lights and stuff, so it was really dark on the streets. And you just knew that if you were out past a certain time near these watchtowers, that it was going to be assumed that you were A, either a thief or an attacker of the city, or B, if you were a woman, you were a prostitute. In either case, the watchmen were employed by the king to make sure that that kind of element was not prevalent in the city, and they would take you by force. So here's this woman screaming out this guy's name, running through the streets. The watchmen see her, and they make an arrest. It says there that they beat her, they bruised her, they took away her cloak, those watchmen of the walls. I mean, they had because she was so freaked out over losing Solomon, these guys had to put the beat down on her to get her to calm down to the point where they could realize this was Solomon's wife. And then at that point, I'm guessing they're like, oh, sorry, queen, hey. But do you see the urgency in her heart? And do you see how God has taken care of teaching her a lesson? Because here's what happens. When we try to teach our spouses a lesson, the lesson doesn't get learned. But when we leave that lesson to God and trust God to teach that person the lesson they need to learn, He's great at doing that. Can't tell you the number of times when I've gotten sideways with Eleanor, left the house with things not completely resolved, which is very rare, but when I have done that, I'll hit my head getting into my car. Has anybody ever done something like that? Like this never happens. Or I'll leave my wallet, this happened once, I leave my wallet on the top of my car as I'm getting in. And I drive away. And I'll reach for my wallet at the drive-in I'm in. I'm like, I don't have my wallet. And by God's grace, I'll retrace my driving steps. I'll find it where it fell off near my mailbox. I'll pick it up. And in that moment, it's like a bright light shines from heaven. Oh, you're a jerk. Go make things right with your wife. Do the right thing. Light goes off. I mean, God has this uncanny way, when we trust Him with this kind of stuff, of getting things done. And that's what's happened here in this situation. Now, Solomon didn't show kindness so that his wife could learn a lesson, but that's what God did in the wake of Solomon showing kindness and grace. You see how that works? All I'm trying to say is that you can't change your spouse. You can't. It needs to be you and God, your trust in Him, that brings about that change. Now, some of you are saying, like, Mark, when is it going to happen then? Come on, man. I mean, I'm losing it over here. This guy's got to figure this out. Hey, our clocks are always different than God's, almost always, right? I mean, we think things should happen yesterday, and God's working on tomorrow. Just be patient. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him. And what's the promise? He'll make our paths straight. He'll direct us. He'll lead it. And listen, how do you know that the things that you're going through in your marriage aren't for your good? That God doesn't have these amazing things to build up in your character as a result of the jerkiness of your spouse? Now, am I saying that that's, I hope every marriage in here has a jerk moment so that people can grow? That's not what I'm saying. But instead of looking, and that's where we're going to go next, instead of looking at the negatives in your relationship all the time, instead of just focusing in on that, trust God with your spouse and choose to focus and accentuate the positives. Write that down in your notes. Choose to see the positive in your spouse. This woman's freaking out. She can't find her spouse. And finally, she goes to her friends. In verse 8, she says, "O daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my lover, what will you tell him?" Here's what you'll tell him. You'll tell him that I'm faint with love. If you see Solomon walking around tonight, you've got to tell him that I'm sorry. You've got to tell him that I blew it. Tell him that I love him and I should have never done what I did. That's what you tell him. The friends come back and they say, "Well, how is your beloved better than others? How is your beloved better than others, the most beautiful of women? How is your beloved better than others that you should charge us so?" Yeah. Okay, sister, we'll tell him that, but it sounds like this guy was late for dinner. It sounds like he got what was coming. I mean, why would you go to such lengths? Why would you go get beat up by the policeman on the walls over a dude who would do that kind of thing to you? They were baiting her. They were saying, "Hey, come on, this guy sounds like a real jerk. Why don't you tell us how big a jerk he is?" But what does she do? She just goes down all the great things that Solomon is instead. Read it with me. "Oh, my lover is radiant and ruddy." He's got a good tan. "He's outstanding among 10,000. If you lined up 10,000 men, I'd pick Solomon every time." She says his head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. He's got a nice head of hair, no plugs. His eyes are like doves by the water streams, washed in milk. That's the whites of his eyes. And mounted like jewels. That's the brilliance of his pupils. His cheeks are like beds of spice yielding perfume. He smells good. His lips are like lilies dripping with myrrh. I love kissing that guy. His arms are rods of gold set with chrysolite. His body is like polished ivory decorated with sapphires. He works out. He especially works out his legs. His legs are pillars made of marble. It's set on bases of pure gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, a beautiful part of the region that they lived in. He's choice as its cedars. His mouth is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovely. This is my lover. This is my friend. O daughters of Jerusalem. You know what? She had a choice that night. She could have just stayed in bed and said, And they would have gone to bed angry, as the Bible teaches us not to do. They would have woken up to another conflict, which would have been the result of that earlier conflict that last night. And they would have just kept going. Because conflict breeds conflict breeds conflict. You with me? But instead, she says, you know what? I'm not going to focus on all the things that he's not. I'm not going to focus on how he failed my expectations. I'm going to focus on what he is and why I married him in the first place. It's usually that ladies that come in and complain to me about their husbands, and not always, but sometimes when they're done complaining, I want to look at them and say, why did you marry this guy? He sounds like Satan's brother.